So we've observed previously to say that this statement, leadership is about achieving a result through people, is actually erroneous. It's wrong because it amounts to an intent by the leader to take. What you should be saying is leadership is about achieving people through results. Now this sounds a little bit odd, but that's exactly what coaches do. A coach doesn't produce a result, that's what players do. What the coach does is that the coach looks at the game and looks at the scoreboard. He gleans information from that in order to coach the player. In other words, the coach doesn't use the player to get a job done and to achieve a result. He uses the result as his means to enable the player. Literally, the coach achieves people through results. Now, if one looks at this from the point of view of our empowerment model, we said empowering somebody would mean, in the first instance, to give the person the means to do what's required of them, to make them able to do what's required of them, and then to hold them accountable. When you're coaching somebody, what you're focusing on is on the issue of ability. And this is very important because it is inappropriate to coach somebody with regard to issues relating to accountability. There's a bias to dealing with ability or wanting to deal with ability when you use the word coaching. And if you're not be careful of that, you will end up coaching people for accountability issues and therefore making the soft mistake. Now, if we look at this issue of ability, the first thing that becomes apparent is that you can't assess somebody's ability if you don't monitor what they're doing. So the first thing the coach does is the coach watches what the coachee is doing in the field. And based on the coachee's performance in the field, the coach makes an assessment of the coachee's ability, his kind of competency requirement. It would then have a conversation with a coachee, and the aim of that conversation would start off with identifying the coachee's ability requirements. Based on that review, the coach would then set the next task in such a way that the deliverable from doing the task is not just that the task gets done. The deliverable is that the coachee actually learns. The coachee then goes off and, if you like, does the next day, plays the next game, does the next job, but the coach monitors what's happening on the field in order to assess whether the coachee is learning what's required of them. And then at the end of that game, the next conversation commences. What we basically have here is the coaching cycle. And the coaching cycle has two elements to it. It has a conversational piece to it. And that conversational piece is, you could call, the reflection, where the coach has a coaching conversation with the coachee, and then it has an action piece to it where the coachee goes off and plays the game, but clearly the coach would still monitor what's happening on the field in order to take a view on whether the coachee's learning what's required of him or not. This coaching conversation goes through 4 phases. The first phase is to diagnose the current competency and ability based on observing the performance of the coachee. And that diagnosis is turned into a clearly phrased learning opportunity, a clearly defined learning opportunity, and preferably a learning opportunity should be singular rather than many. So if there are 3 or 4 competency requirements, the learning opportunity for the next coaching cycle should focus on one particular issue. After having established the learning opportunity, the coach then identifies the tasks that are going to put pressure on the person's learning opportunity. In other words, the coach thinks of the job that the coachee is going to do from the point of view of it being a gymnasium, and he isolates the elements of that task which will help to progress the coachee's competency. Based on that, the coach then sets the next task in such a way that learning becomes the deliverable of doing the next job and not just that the job gets done. What's clear in these 4 steps of this conversation is that there's a dividing line where the first 2 elements are diagnostic in character and the second 2 elements are remedial in character. In order to be able to have this conversation properly, there are 2 key skills involved: listening and questioning. And if we specifically look at the listening part of the problem, any conversation you've had where you experienced that somebody was answering you back before you finished speaking, you would know you weren't being listened to. And it means that for that person to listen to you, they have to stop giving attention to their own agenda so they can give attention to yours. So the first part of listening is to suspend your own agenda, which means shut up, seek to understand, and not to be understood. The second part of listening well is actually just being available. Now, in order to quieten the internal dialogue, we have a very simple exercise that really does work. And that is, before the meeting starts, you identify 3 colors in the room. So let's say, for instance, you start off with black. You find all the things in the room that are black, and then you go to all the things in the room that are red, for example, and all the things that are white, for example. And having done that, you then identify 3 different sounds. The sound that is the furthest from you, the sound that is in the middle distance, and the sound that is closest to you, maybe even your own breathing or your own heartbeat. Because you've focused your attention on 6 things that are actually going on in the situation that you're in, the volume of your internal dialogue is just quieter. Moving on to the questioning part of the process, it's useful to ask empowering questions. In the first instance, even if you just ask why 5 times, because what you do by doing this is you basically uncover root causes. You can also use the Rogerian kind of technique, which is to reflect back to the person by making statements like, so you're saying that, or so you think that, or so you feel that. And what's interesting about these statements is that you're not really saying anything new to the person. I mean, you're basically showing them a mirror of what they're saying. But that has 2 effects. First of all, the person feels understood. And secondly, it allows the person to clarify. They could say, well, it's not quite like that. They can then say a little bit more. It's also important to note that with this technique, you're not just reflecting back content, which is what this first statement, so you're saying that, is really suggesting. The second statement, so you feel back, that for instance reflects back feeling. So, I mean, you say to the person, how are you this morning? And the person says, fine. And then it's quite legitimate to say to the person, well, it sounds like you feel a little bit annoyed. They've not actually said that, but it's certainly they've carried that message in their feeling. And very often people also carry a message in terms of what they think. So you reflect back whatever you hear from the person, what you're experiencing from the person, to allow the person to clarify. This coaching conversation, therefore, just to remind us, goes through the following phases. It starts us with a review. It ends up with setting the task in such a way that the person will learn from doing the task. There are 2 elements to it. There's a diagnostic element and there's a remedial element. The diagnostic element goes through 2 phases. You diagnose the person's current competency or ability. You establish the learning opportunity on the basis of that diagnosis. You then identify the tasks that would put pressure on the learning opportunity. And then you set the next job that the person is going to do in such a way that learning becomes a deliverable of doing the job and not just that the job gets done.